The morning sun beamed down on Riverwood Elementary, a modern structure nestled in the heart of Pinewood City. The streets outside bustled with the excited chatter of children hurrying to school, their colorful clothes a stark contrast to the dull gray of the sidewalk. Parents waved goodbye from cars, already dreading the routine of their busy days. Inside the school, however, one thing was about to shift the balance of normalcy. It was Noah Kai's first day. Noah was different. He wasn't the typical outgoing child with friends already waiting to greet him. Instead, he stood nervously at the back of Mrs. Gladew's Shelton's classroom, trying to blend into the shadows. At just 10 years old, he was already smaller than the other boys, wearing a simple blue shirt, jeans, and sneakers. He had just moved to Pinewood with his family, and today was supposed to be his fresh start. But the moment Mrs. Shelton laid eyes on him, it was clear his day would take a different turn. She was known for her strictness, but there was something else about her, a harshness that cut through any room she entered. Noah had no idea what was coming. "Hey you." Mrs. Shelton's voice sliced through the classroom like a blade. "The new kid in the back, come up here and introduce yourself." Noah's heart pounded as he stood, already feeling the weight of all eyes on him. He hated being the center of attention. But this wasn't just any introduction. Mrs. Shelton's gaze was sharp and calculating, her lips pressed in a thin, judgmental line. "What's your name?" she barked. "Noah," he mumbled, barely loud enough for the room to hear. "Speak up," she snapped. "You're not hiding in the back anymore, little boy." Some of the other kids snickered, but most remained silent, sensing the tension in the room. Noah's face flushed red with embarrassment, and he quickly returned to his seat, praying the ordeal would end. But Mrs. Shelton wasn't done. Her eyes followed him as he sat, her silent judgment still heavy in the air. Little did anyone know this first moment would be the start of something much bigger. Mrs. Shelton's treatment of Noah wasn't going unnoticed. And soon, her life would turn upside down in ways she never saw coming. Days passed, and Noah's experiences in Mrs. Shelton's class only grew worse. She singled him out for every tiny mistake, the smallest infraction. His handwriting was never neat enough, and if he didn't raise his hand quickly enough, she would reprimand him in front of everyone. Every comment from her was another mark against him, another reason he felt humiliated and small. But Noah never let it show. He stayed quiet, absorbed in his work, and focused on getting through each day. At home, his parents, the Kais, were unaware of the bullying. Noah had kept everything bottled up, not wanting to worry them, especially his father, Mr. Wee Kai, the principal of Riverwood Elementary. Noah's secret was a big one. While most of the school saw Mr. Kai as the stern but fair principal, no one knew he was Noah's father. The Kai family had decided to keep this under wraps, hoping Noah could have a regular school experience without the special treatment that might come from his father's position. But Noah knew that something wasn't right. And though his father was proud of him for staying strong, Noah's struggles weren't going unnoticed in another way. Someone else had been paying attention. Someone who had the power to change everything. One afternoon, after another grueling day at school, Noah entered his father's office looking more upset than usual. His father was sitting behind his desk, going over the school's budget and paperwork. But when he looked up, he could see something wasn't right. Noah's usual quiet demeanor was tinged with frustration and sadness. "Dad, why does Mrs. Shelton hate me so much?" Noah's voice was quiet, filled with a mix of confusion and hurt. Mr. Kai's heart sank as he heard his son's words. His anger simmered beneath the surface. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it from Noah himself made it undeniable. Mrs. Shelton wasn't just being strict. She was targeting Noah, and that was something he could not tolerate. The principal stayed calm, not wanting to reveal too much yet. "Hang in there, Noah," he said gently. "She doesn't know who you are yet. But she will soon enough." Noah didn't fully understand what his father meant, but he trusted him. He had learned to be strong, to endure even when things felt unfair. But little did he know that the next few days would bring a reckoning, one Mrs. Shelton wouldn't be able to ignore. It was a cold Thursday morning when everything changed. Mrs. Shelton had been especially hard on Noah that day, accusing him of not finishing his homework even though he had. The tension in the room was palpable as she called him to the front of the class. "This is what happens when you don't try hard enough," Mrs. Shelton snapped, her voice full of disdain. "You'll never succeed if you keep this up." The classroom fell silent as Noah stood there, trying not to let the tears sting his eyes. But something inside him snapped. He had endured enough. He wasn't the same scared, shy boy he had been at the start of the year. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Shelton turned to walk back to her desk, her words lingering in the air. And then the door to the classroom opened. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Kai. His presence was commanding, and for a moment everything in the room seemed to freeze. The students immediately sat up straighter, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Mrs. Shelton froze as well, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Mrs. Shelton," Mr. Kai said, his voice calm but firm, "could I speak to you in my office, please?" No one could have predicted the chain of events that was about to unfold, but Noah's life was about to change forever. Inside the principal's office, Mrs. Shelton's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She had no idea why Mr. Kai was here or what this conversation would bring. But she quickly learned the truth. Mr. Kai's voice was steady but filled with disappointment. "Noah is my son," he said quietly. "And you've been treating him unfairly for weeks now." Mrs. Shelton's face drained of color. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been bullying the principal's son without even knowing it. And it wasn't just her harsh teaching style. This was something much worse. She had targeted Noah because of his background, not because of anything he had done. Mr. Kai's words were measured but heavy with the weight of his authority. "No student should ever be treated this way, especially not in my school. I expect better from my staff." As the truth sank in, Mrs. Shelton's face twisted in a mix of shame and panic. The consequences of her actions were now unavoidable. The following day, things were different at Riverwood Elementary. When Noah arrived at school, he was met by a new teacher. Mrs. Shelton was gone. Noah's heart lifted as he stepped into the classroom, greeted by the warm smile of the new teacher, who made him feel welcomed, safe, and valued. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for so long was finally lifted. But Mrs. Shelton's fate had already been sealed. Her actions had caught up with her, and the consequences were harsh. She had learned the hard way that prejudice and cruelty never go unnoticed, no matter how hard you try to hide it. Noah now knew that no matter how hard things had seemed, there was always a way to make things right, and that people who treated others unfairly would always face the truth eventually. The next few days were a blur for Mrs. Shelton. She had never imagined that her cruel behavior could lead to her downfall, especially not in such a public way. The shame of being called out by the principal, who just so happened to be Noah's father, was enough to make her question everything. But the hardest part wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the realization that she had harmed a child, a quiet and humble boy, simply because of a prejudice she didn't even fully understand. As she packed her things, preparing to leave the school for good, she couldn't help but reflect on the harsh words she'd thrown at Noah. She had been so focused on maintaining control and discipline that she had lost sight of the humanity in her students. And now she had to face the consequences. With Mrs. Shelton gone, a new chapter began for Noah. His new teacher, Mrs. Parker, was warm, understanding, and fair. The first day in her class felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time since arriving at Riverwood, Noah felt like he could be himself. He could speak up without fear of ridicule. He could make friends without worrying about being singled out. Even though he had always been a strong, silent type, Noah's confidence grew day by day. He found a new joy in learning, and the weight that had once pressed heavily on his shoulders started to lift. He was no longer just the quiet boy in the back. He was someone people genuinely wanted to know. Noah had learned something valuable in his short time at Riverwood. Standing up for yourself, even in small ways, could make a huge difference. And the most important lesson of all was that kindness and fairness were always the right path, no matter the circumstances. Mrs. Shelton, on the other hand, couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. After her dismissal, she found it hard to regain her footing. Her reputation was tarnished, not just at Riverwood but in the entire school district. Word had spread quickly about her treatment of Noah, and many teachers and staff members expressed their disappointment in her behavior. Some tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but the damage was done. She had shown a side of herself that was unforgivable, and now she had to live with the consequences. Her career, once on a steady path, had unraveled in an instant. The lesson she learned, though painful, was a hard truth. No one could hide their true nature forever. As time went on, Noah thrived in his new environment. He found himself making friends, excelling in his studies, and even joining extracurricular activities. His confidence grew stronger, and the memories of Mrs. Shelton's cruelty faded, replaced by the encouragement and kindness he received from those around him. For Noah, it wasn't just about surviving the school year. It was about realizing that he could overcome anything as long as he stayed true to himself. His bond with his father, Mr. Kai, also grew deeper. Noah admired his father's calm demeanor and how he had stood up for him when no one else would. Together they made a team that no one could break. As for Mrs. Shelton, her story was a cautionary tale. She had learned the hard way that treating others unfairly, especially those who were vulnerable, always comes back to haunt you. And though Noah would never forget the pain she had caused him, he also knew that people could change, and that everyone deserved a second chance to grow from their mistakes. But one thing was for certain: no one would ever treat Noah the way Mrs. Shelton had again. Not with his father's watchful eye over him, and not with the lessons he had learned about strength, kindness, and justice.